And indeed, Monica doesn't have any restrictions on the institute. However, she cannot see the balance. Hi, my name is Zach Adda, and I'm a pre-sales engineer with Exasol. And today we're going to cover column and row level security within an Exasol database. So first, what I'm going to do is go through a brief presentation here where we're going to talk about the use case and why you might want to implement row and column level security. And then for the majority of the presentation, what we'll go ahead and do is actually get in an Exasol database and walk through the setup and usage of row and column level security. So without further ado, I think the first thing is to kind of talk about the use case and why we want to use row and column level security. So let's pretend for a moment that we are a banking organization and we actually have a table stored in our Exasol database that has some sensitive information, and we want to make sure that our end users can only see certain components of this table. And so the table that we're going to be working with today is just a basic table where we have an ID column, a first name, a last name, the email address of our customers, and then some more sensitive information such as gender, balance, credit score, social security number. And then we also have an institute column here, which is probably perhaps where the customer does their banking and which institute that is. So what's going to kind of drive our row and column level security is some sort of business rules that our banking organization has. And so for this example, we're going to use 3 of our users or bank employees. So first we have Monica, and Monica is a global manager. And so looking at her business rules, what we can see is that she is able to see all institutes. So when we look at the institute column, we see that there's various types of values that can be from Institute 7, Institute 4, and Institute 10. Well, when she queries this table, she can see all those institutes, no problem there. However, she's not allowed to see the balance. So that must be some private information that she shouldn't be privy and be able to see. Then we have Steve, who's a manager of Institute 1. So naturally, he has a business rule where he's only going to be allowed to see data from Institute 1. And then similar to Monica, he's also not allowed to see the balance. Then lastly, we have Jake here, who is a clerk at Institute 2. So similar to Steve, because he's responsible for Institute 2, he can only see data from Institute 2 and only people with the last name starting with S through Z. So perhaps Jake has the customers with the last name starting through S through Z that are assigned to him or that he's responsible for. And then he has a few further restrictions. For example, he's not only not allowed to see the balance, similar to Steve and Monica, but he's also not allowed to see the credit score or social security number. So kind of looking at about how this starts to translate to our database and our row and column level security, what's highlighted in green is going to be our row level security. And so the way that we know it's row level security is because it's based on a value that is stored in a column. So for example, looking at the Institute 1 business rule, what we're going to be looking for is in our Institute column a value Institute 1, and we're going to filter the data based off of that value. Then we also have our column level security, which is where we're actually going to obfuscate or mask an entire column. And so that's kind of how we start to see the differences here. And so obviously, what's highlighted in green is going to be our row level security, and then our column level security is going to be in this bluish green color. And we'll get into how we actually implement that here in a moment. So here is how we're actually going to configure this within Exasol. So there's kind of 3 parts that we're going to go through to set this up. The first, starting in the lower left here, is we're going to create roles to filter rows and essentially create a view of the table for the user based off their roles that they have. So if you look in the top right here, we're going to create 4 roles in this example. One is going to be a general access role. And so essentially what this role is by default, once we set up row and column level security, users will not be able to see any of the table data. So when they send in, select star from table, they won't get any results back. So what we need to do is create a general access role to be able to give a user access to see all of the records in that table and kind of start from square one. If they don't have any other roles assigned to them, then we would give them the general access role to be able to query all of the data. However, what we can also do is create these additional roles that are specific to our business rules. So for example, we'll create a role for Institute 1. So this role will ensure that users see Institute 1. Then we'll see a role for Institute 2, where they can only query data for Institute 2. Then we'll have a final role, last name, S through Z, which only allows the user to see roles where the last name of the customer starts with S through Z. And so the way this is going to work, and we'll show this as a working example, but if you have a general access role and let's say Institute 1, then the way that the row and column level security is configured in Exasol is that the more stern privileges is what will be applied. So having both general access and Institute 1 means you will only be able to see records from Institute 1. So then the second phase of this is choosing which columns are secured to everyone. So again, we want to default on the side of security. And so we're going to specify which columns in that table do we want to restrict or secure. Then in the third step, what we're going to do is actually give that access back out to the users based on a role. So we're going to create two roles for our example. We're going to create CLS balance allowed. This is going to allow users to see the balance. And then we're also going to create another role called details allowed. This is going to, as we'll see, allow you to see both the credit score and the social security number. Okay, so now we know what roles we're going to set up, but how do we actually apply these roles, and how does Exasol know how to use these roles to filter the data? Well, we use one of Exasol's really cool features called virtual schemas, and usually virtual schemas are used to query some other data source and surface that data in Exasol. But in this case, we're going to repurpose it for our row and column level security. And we're going to do this by creating a self connection. So we're going to connect our Exasol database to itself. And so essentially what we're going to do is create a virtual schema on our source table. So for example, we're going to create a schema and a table within that schema. And the schema that is our source is going to be called our bank. Then we're going to create a virtual schema on top of, or based off of that schema, called secured bank. And we're only giving our end users access to the secured bank schema. So they have to go through the secured bank schema to get to the underlying data in the our bank schema. So on the right hand side here, what we're going to see is our user Steve, and he's going to send a query to the virtual schema. And this query is going to be against the secured bank .customer table. And he's going to have a one where condition in there where it's last name equals Smith. However, when this query goes into the virtual schema is going to use its adapter script to essentially intercept that query and check the roles that Steve has, and based off of those roles, apply further constraints and where conditions to that SQL statement. So as you can see, the outputting SQL statement to the source table in our bank schema is going to not only have the where clause last name equals Smith, but is also going to have where institute equals institute _1. And then that result set is going to be filtered and therefore returned back to Steve, and the security is applied in that layer. So once we get through the setup here, then what we're going to do is talk about how easy it is to maintain the row and column level security. And we're going to do that by, one, updating a current user, our global manager, Monica. But then what we're also going to do is add a new user, Jessica, who's going to be an intern at Institute 1. So I'm bringing this up for reference so we can look at this while we actually deploy this in our Exasol database. So let me go ahead and pull this over to the side. Alrighty, so I'm running Exasol on my local desktop on a virtual machine. And let's just go ahead and get started. So I'm going to reconnect just to make sure we're good to go. So the first thing that we need to do is prepare our environment, and let's just go ahead and start by creating our users in the database. So we're going to create Monica, Steve, and Jake. Excellent. Then what we need to do is give them access to our database and allow them to even connect to the database. So we're going to grant create session to each of our users. Then for testing purposes, you won't need to do this when you actually deploy into like a production environment or whatnot, but during setup and testing, this is a very easy way to quickly switch from user to user. So we're going to use a fun feature in Exasol called impersonation, and we're just going to create a role and assign that role to each of our users. And then we're going to grant impersonation to each of our users with that role. Okay, so now that our kind of setup is out of the way, let's go ahead and create our source schema and the table that resides within that source schema. So we're going to create our base schema, which is our bank. Then what we're going to do is create a table within that schema called customer. And so this is the table that we had described in our slides. We're going to have an ID, first name, last name, email, gender, balance, credit score, social security number, and an institute. So we'll go ahead and create that table, and then let's go ahead and load some data into this table so that we can test our row and column level security. All right, so we loaded up 1,000 records into our table, and let's go ahead and take a look at what that data looks like. Okay, so we pull this over here, and what we will see is that we have our IDs, first name, last name, gender, balance, credit score, social security number, and institute, and we have 1,000 records. So this is, of course, running as our sys user, our admin of the database. We can see every record, we can see every column, no problem. But when it comes to our end users, we'll need to change that. So let's get down into our metadata setup. So what we're going to have to do here is a little work up front and configuration so that when we actually set up our adapter and virtual schema, it has something to reference to know how a role maps to certain conditions. So, we had our role level security roles and we had our column level security roles. Well, the adapter needs to know when a user comes in and they have a certain role, how do I need to either filter based off of a value in a column, so row level security, or do I need to obfuscate or mask a column for that user? And so that's the setup we're about to do now. And so our metadata schema is going to be RLS privs schema. So we create that, and then what we're going to do is start by creating our row level security roles. And this is just creating the name of the role. So let's start by creating our RLS Institute 1 role, and we know that this is going to provide the ability to see Institute 1 records. We'll create that. We'll do the same for Institute 2. And then we're going to create a third role, which is going to be giving access to see customers with the last name starting with S through Z. So basically these three roles take care of our two users, Steve and Jake. So only seeing data from Institute 1, and then only seeing data from Institute 2, as well as only people with last names starting with S through Z. However, like we said, the way this is set up now, Monica doesn't have one of these roles, or wouldn't have one of these roles assigned to her, so she wouldn't be able to see any data in that table. So what we're going to do is create a role for users such as her, where it's going to be called general access. So in the absence of any other type of row level security, they'll get the general access role if they're to see any data there. All right, so now what we're going to do is essentially create a row policy. And so what our row policy is going to be is the mapping of the role name to the schema and table in which this role the rule should be applied, and then the where clause that tells the adapter how to filter this data. So let's create this table. And then if you're concerned about entering duplicate records, you can add some constraints to that table. And now what we're going to do is start inserting some data into this kind of metadata table. So the first thing we're going to do is create the mapping for our Institute 1. So we enter our role name here. Then it's going to be the source schema and the source table that we want this applied to. And then this is going to be the where condition that is applied to this table and is associated to this role. And so what you can do is actually test this where condition out as a system administrator to where you want to query our source schema and table, our bank customer, where the institute equals Institute 1. So if we run this, we see that we get all Institute 1 results back. So this is the filtering that's going to be done when you have the rule RLS Institute 1. Then what we're going to do is move along and add our second one, which is our role Institute 2. And we're going to update our where condition to be Institute 2. And then is this active? Yes, it is. Create that. Then what we're going to do is create a row policy for last name S through Z. And so we have a little bit more of a complex where statement, but this is going to get all of our customers that have a last name that starts with S through Z and is also active. And then again, this is our general access row. So we're going to map this to our general access role. And then what we're going to do is pass in a where statement that always evaluates to true. All right. So now what we can do is query this metadata table. And what we see is our roles, the schema and table this applies to, and the where clause that will be applied to this table when it's queried by any users with these roles. And we'll come back to this later. So now we took care of our row level security. Now what we need to do is create our column level security. So we're going to have two roles that we create. The first one is going to be called balance allowed. And we will use this to be able to allow users to see the balance. And then we're going to create a role called details allowed, which we'll see is going to allow users to see the credit scored and the social security number. All right, so now what we need to do is, like we said, the second step is to define which columns by default in the table are going to be restricted. So this table is what stores that information. So we're going to specify the schema name, the table name that we want to secure, and the column name that we want to make secure, and whether that column security is active. Again, if you're concerned about duplicates, you can add constraints to this table. And now what we will do, pull this down just a little bit, and let's insert some values into this newly created table, and let's specify that on our source table, customer, and schema, our bank, we will restrict balance, credit score, and social security number. And then what we can do is take a look at our restricted columns anytime we need to by querying this table. And we see for these tables, we're going to restrict these columns. Okay, now we have some columns restricted by default. Now we get to give permission out to users on whether they can see that column or not. Otherwise, by default, they're going to be restricted, which is exactly what we want. Okay, so let's create or replace our table column allowed policy. This is where we specify the role that's going to map to the table that they can gain access to, and in that table, which column, secured column, will they be able to see, and whether this is active or not. For duplicates, enable constraints. And let's set our role restrictions. Pull this down so we can see. So what we're going to do is insert values role name, schema name, table name, and column name. So we're going to map CLS balance allowed to our balance column. Then what we're going to do is map our CLS details allowed twice, okay, to both the credit score and the social security number. And so when we go and we query this table to see what the mapping is, we can see that our role, so users with the role balance allowed, can see balance, and then any user with details allowed can see the credit score and social security number. So this kind of shows the flexibility that you can have when creating these roles and mappings to conditions, because if you wanted to, you could have created an individual role for credit score, an individual role for social security, and then applied those multiple times applied both of those to a user that can see a credit score and social security number. But since it's very common for users to see both credit score and social security number, we went ahead and made this just one role and simplified how we assign those roles to users. All right, so now it's time to actually start granting these roles to our users. And so what I recommend is running each of these SQL statements that we've done, of all of our metadata tables. So let's go ahead and run those. And we get our row policy, our restricted column policy, and then the columns allowed. And so what we can do is pin these here. And now we can reference these when we walk through our business rules. So let's start with Monica first. And so Monica can see all records because Monica is the global manager. So we know we aren't applying any other row level security here. So like we've mentioned a couple times before, she won't be able to see any records until we give her this general access. So this lets her see all the records. So let's assign that to Monica. Then what we see is that she's not allowed to see the balance. So by default, we look at our restricted policy and we see that for users, balance, credit score, and social security number are restricted. And if she cannot see the balance, then we need to give her access to see the credit score and social security number. That's why we're going to give her CLS details allowed. And we see that by going here and saying CLS details allowed gets us credit score and social security number. Okay, so let's move to Steve now. And we know that Steve can only see data from Institute 1, looking at our chart here. And so we need to assign him the role Institute 1. And then we also see, similar to Monica, Steve is not allowed to see the balance. So let's give him also CLS details allowed, because he can indeed see the details. Then moving down to Jake, we know he can only see Institute 2. So we see here Institute 2, okay, that where clause looks correct. Let's apply that to Jake. And then he is only allowed to see customers with the last name S through Z. So we'll give him that role as well. And then Jake's not allowed to see the balance, the credit score, or social security number. So we don't have to apply any column level security because all of those are already restricted. So we're good to go there. Okay, so now we have all of our setup done basically as far as users and roles and whatnot. But now these users don't have access to our source database. So this is where we need to create the self-connection to our database and create a virtual schema on our source schema and table so that we can grant our users access to that and they can query, and all of these rules will be applied. So the first thing we're going to do is create a new schema, if it doesn't exist, called adapter schema. Adapter schema. Alrighty. And now what we're going to do is run our Python script. Just want to make sure. Yep. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and run our Python script. This is our adapter script. This is where the magic happens, where we read those metadata tables when a query comes in and apply the right permissions and filtering based off a user's role. So I'll spare you going through this whole Python script, and we will just move on down here to the self-connection. So like I said, this is when we connect the database to itself. So this is my internal IP address and port for my virtual machine. I have the out-of-the-box username and password for my database. So we'll go ahead and create this connection, and it's going to have the title self-connection. I think I might have. There we go. Must have clicked somewhere the wrong way. Okay, so now what we're going to do after we create our connection is we're going to utilize that self connection in our SQL to create a virtual schema. We're going to create this virtual schema and we're going to call it secured bank. What we're going to do is use the adapter script that we created just above, which was written in Python. And we are going to say that the table schema is our bank. So this is the schema that we want to create a virtual schema on top of. So let's go ahead and run that. Okay, that is completed. And now what we can do is actually, if you're curious, look over here. We can refresh our object tree, and now we see all of our good stuff here. So we have first our source schema, which is our bank, and the table's customer. Okay. Then what we have is our RLS privileges schema with our tables, and these tables have all of our metadata and the mapping of the roles to the where conditions. Then we have our adapter schema where we stored our Python script. It's an adapter script. And then lastly, we have a virtual schema that we just created called secured bank. And when we look in here, we see a customer table. So we are very close. So now what we need to do is give our end users access to this schema so that they can pass their queries in. So let's grant select on secured bank to Monica, Steve, and Jake. Excellent. Now it's time to try it out. And this is where our impersonation comes into play. It makes things a lot easier. So let's impersonate Monica. And we'll do select current user so that we can see that we are her indeed. Yep. And let's just do a select count from our secured bank. And she doesn't have any row level security. So what we see is 1,000 records back. And if you remember when we did our import, there's 1,000 records in our table, so that makes sense. But let's go ahead and actually query the table, just do a full scan and see what we get back. Okay, let's pull this out. And indeed, Monica doesn't have any restrictions on the institute. However, she cannot see the balance per our business rule here. So this looks to be working correctly. Then let's go ahead and impersonate Steve. Okay, so we are Steve, and Steve can only see records from Institute 1. So I think it's safe to say we know that there's not only Institute 1 records in our table, so this select count should be much smaller than 1,000. And indeed it is. It's 118 records. So let's see what these records are. And similar to Monica, he should not see the balance either. Okay, and we pull this out. Excellent. So what we see is all Institute 1, and then he is not allowed to see the balance either. Okay, now let's go ahead and impersonate Jake. Make sure we are Jake. And let's go ahead and do a select count. And this is probably going to be whittled down even more because Jake can only see records for Institute 2, and then further, only customers that have a last name that start with S through Z. But I'm not sure how many records are for Institute 2, so let's take a look. Okay, well, a combination of those two filters puts us at 21 records, so definitely less than 1,000. And now let's take a look at all the records he can see when he queries the entire table. Okay, excellent. So this looks great. So Steve, as we know, can only see Institute 2 records, which we do see here. And then he is unable to see the balance, credit score, or social security number. So this looks great. He has all of his masking enabled for his view. Okay, so now to wrap up, let's just show how easy it is to continue to maintain this and apply this to new rules to existing users, or just create new users and apply the roles to them. So let's go ahead and impersonate Sys again so we can get back to creating some users. And let's create our intern Jessica for Institute 1. So we are going to create her user, and grant her create session so she can query the database. Then what we're going to do is look at her business rules, and it shows that she can only see data from Institute 1. So that means that she will get the role Institute 1. And then she should not see the balance, the social security number, or the credit score. So we don't have to apply any column level security because all of those are already restricted. So let's just go ahead and grant her the ability to query our virtual schema, which is secured bank. And then for testing, let's grant her impersonation. Let's go ahead and impersonate Jessica. Make sure we are Jessica. Okay, and let's see what we get back. All right, so that looks similar to Steve, because Institute 1, there must only be 118 records of that. And then let's go ahead and see what data she can view. Excellent, so very similar to Steve's, except she can not see the credit score nor the social security number either, and then only records in Institute 1. Excellent. And then lastly, let's go ahead and update Monica's privileges. So we will go ahead and impersonate Sis again. And in this case, we want to now give her access to be able to see the balance as well. So she should be able to see the whole table now. So let's go ahead and grant CLS balance allowed to give her access to the balance, because that's restricted. And impersonate her and make sure we are Monica. And let's go ahead and look at how many records we get back. It is 1,000, which was the same as before, but now we should be able to see the balance. And indeed we can. Excellent. Well, that's all we have to share today. And of course, if you have any questions, would like to get on a call where we do this demo with you, or you need help implementing this, we are here to help. So just reach out to us and we'd be more than happy to hop on a phone call. Also, if you have any feedback about the row and column level security, we'd love to hear it. So we'll provide all these files and the ability to recreate this on your own. Otherwise, thank you so much for your attention and really appreciate it.